In the 15 years since Hellbent's initial release in the festival circuit, online distribution has only become more popularised and profitable, and in my final episode's case study, we will explore the queer slasher narrative in the digital age and the importance of online distribution for queer artists.
You're Killing Me, directed by Jim Hansen and written by Hansen and Jeffrey Self, was released in 2015 under Wolf Releasing, seeing wider online distribution in 2016. The film tells the story of George, a gay man trying to find success on YouTube, and his developing relationship with the enigmatic but troubling Joe, an active serial killer. You're Killing Me saw relative popularity among critics and online circles, receiving praise for its depiction of modern gay culture in the digital age and its take on slasher narratives and tropes.
So, homosexuals and feministes alike, today's final episode of Queerness Slasher will be discussing the representations of gay male and camp sensibility throughout You're Killing Me, and how gay culture is represented and used through the lens of the slasher narrative.
It'll additionally explore You're Killing Me's representation of neurodivergency, romantic comedy, and its comparison with similar representations of empathy for the monstrous in other horror texts. Within the context of academic theory, You're Killing Me has seen little discussion outside of online circles, so this episode will be primarily focusing its discussion around critical frameworks surrounding the text, with brief intervention to discuss the importance of the digital age for queer people. While You're Killing Me saw most of its success through the LGBT festival circuit, another attribute for its distribution was down to an online release through Wolf Videos on Vimeo. A large part of success in the digital age of cinema and media comes down to the success of online distribution and sharing through social media, and it can be a vital component for independent filmmaking in the 2010s. The ease of spreading art and ideas through digital means is appealing for queer creators because of an ease of access, as well as theoretical ideas of online media being a subversion and resistance to dominant media messages, much like the slasher genre resists the heteropatriarchal ideas of wider society. Dewey argues that the recent draw to online forms of entertainment largely comes from a widespread subversion or outright rejection of the dominant media messages of today's cultural zeitgeist.
Questions and criticisms about respectable societies can now be given a voice to, while before only existing in the margins. It is with the accessibility of digital media in the 2010s that broader interpretations about marginalised identities, about queerness, can be changed.
With this knowledge, it's easy to understand why You're Killing Me would depict gay men directly working within shareable media and the digital age. Net praised You're Killing Me for being a queer horror film embedded in specifically self-reflexive camp, stating everyone involved seems to be well aware of how exactly You're Killing Me is winking at themselves and us. Much like Scream before it, You're Killing Me is campy, self-reflexive, and metatextual in its humour. When written by gay men, both subtextually queer and explicitly queer texts often have a unique form of self-reflexivity within them. Jeffrey Self admits to basing his character, George, largely on his own performative personality, which, much like Bram Stoker in Dracula way back when, questions authorial insertion in intent within queer horror. You're Killing Me operates as an explicitly queer text because of its self-reflexivity, only possible from being written by gay men. Additionally, You're Killing Me represents a specific queer sensibility. Though loosely defined in previous chapters as enacting outrageous inversions of aesthetic and gender codes, while simultaneously always being a critique on heterosexual privilege and presumption, You're Killing Me provides a mixture of both the dedication to dethrone the serious, e.g. the heterosexual and patriarchal, and the playful anti-serious that remains rooted in the deeply queer sensibility. You need only look at the film's online synopsis to understand its dedication to an absurdist camp. Joe and George met just as Joe is coming out to himself as someone who loves to kill. George, on the other hand, can't decide which wig to wear for his next YouTube video. If Hellbent was an attempt to distance itself from camp sensibility, You're Killing Me takes every opportunity to have an anti-serious play rooted in every facet of its development. This was part of the reason it was so celebrated amongst the festival circuit, with gay critics and writers praising the film as being a hilariously truthful depiction of gay men in the 2010s. O'Keefe describes the film as a unique take on queer horror and a metaphorical tale of what happens when earnestness meets irony. When George and his friends playfully banter with each other, they are demonstrating gestures full of duplicity, of a witty meaning and condescension, and another, more impersonal, for outsiders. George and his friends live their lives like a skit, performing for an invisible audience, an experience shared by many gay men, and something that Judith Butler has cited as an integral facet of queer identity.
You know, you're born naked and the rest is drag.
It is because of this narcissistic involvement in the self in the exaggerated performance of gayness, Joe is able to demonstrate his own means of camp. Throughout You're Killing Me, Joe represents the innocent. While Joe is a serial killer and admits openly to being such, George and his friends are so involved in their own lives, their own renditions of camp, that they think Joe is playing along with them. When Joe first meets George, he says openly,
"I just killed a guy last night for the first time."
And George responds by saying,
"So what, you're telling me, like, you're some lonely murderer who I'm giving my number to?" Hot.
Sontag writes, "The pure examples of camp are unintentional. They are dead serious, and camp rests on innocence, a definition which fits Joe's depiction throughout the film. While not morally innocent, Joe doesn't understand the group's use of sarcasm, again another mean of delivering camp and queerness, and receives George's banter literally to the degree of murdering his parents when George smiles at the suggestion of him killing them. It is with this depiction of queerness, however, that draws George and Joe close together. Additionally, it is through this innocent display of camp that Joe's potential neurodivergency is presented. In the middle of the film, Joe invites George to a meal with his parents. The image of parents at the dinner table is one with a particular connotation amongst closeted queer people and new gay relationships, with one side representing heteronormativity and the patriarchal family unit in practice, and the other side representing the direct opposite, a queering of the traditional. The dinner table, while typically associated with peace and unity, now signifies a place of either relief or rejection. George is nervous but tries to reassure himself, saying,
But that's okay. Parents always loved me.
Aligning himself with the long, if stereotypical, unity of gay men with mother figures. George's self-assurances fall flat, though. Joe's mother is represented as a strict matriarch of the family, and his father, who is silent throughout the scene, is represented as a detached figure, uninterested in his child. George is the first friend of Joe's to be introduced to his parents, which is a particular stressor on George when Joe makes his romantic intentions clear. When Joe's mother chastises him for openly admitting to his time spent in the psychiatric hospital,
"I thought we agreed that that was something we were leaving in your past."
Joe responds,
"Well, Dr. Strauss said it was important for me to be open and upfront with the people that I care about."
At this point in the film, Joe and George have only known each other for 5 days, and Joe's hyper-focusing on George as an example of both his neurodivergency and his queerness. George interprets Joe's honesty and perceived empathy as romantic signifiers, but Joe's mother is naturally skeptical about the legitimacy of the relationship. However, George interprets her comments towards him as casually homophobic and appears visibly upset when she claims,
"I'm going to be very honest with you, George. Joe is a very troubled boy, and it reflects poorly on your character that you have not yet discerned this."
The audience knows this is true, that George is too involved with his own self-performance to notice the danger that Joe might pose to him. However, through George's lens, we can potentially interpret Joe's mother as being dismissive and cruel to Joe's neurodivergency. Her line,
"Connected. Should you be connecting?"
is particularly evocative when discussing the potential of sexual relationships between abled and disabled people, and his desire for a fulfilling relationship with George.
And it's here where I want to make a brief interruption to discuss neurodivergency through a queer lens.
Neurodivergency is a term associated with developmental disabilities, typically autism and Asperger's. It is often associated with a misunderstanding of sarcasm, blunt honesty, and a struggling to feel empathy for other people. While Joe's character could be traditionally associated with psychopathy, the interpretation of him as autistic is equally validated through the text. Queer autistic people have expressed difficulty in connecting to their communities, exemplified by Joe's lack of a romantic past and his distance from other gay people. Similarly, while some autistic people identify as asexual in their adulthood, as many can be identified as queer and hypersexual, and with occasional violent and paraphilic desires, which is again exemplified by Joe's aversion to sex despite his violent and deeply homoerotic fantasies. While the representation of a coded autistic as a monotone serial killer can be problematic, it does align itself closely with the history of coded villains in the slasher genre, much like the history of queer villains. It is my belief that throughout the film, George understands Joe to be neurodivergent, and following the dinner scene, he displays anger at Joe's mother calling him disturbed. When Joe dejectedly agrees with his mother, George insists,
"You're not disturbed, Joe. They're the ones with the problem. Not you. You're perfect."
Though the audience knows that Joe is in fact deeply disturbed, since the scene is followed by Joe killing his parents and setting his childhood house on fire, George's empathy for Joe's more troubling traits appropriately leads me on to the final subject of this essay, and one of my favourite tropes in horror history.
You're Killing Me was a culmination of Jim Henson's love of horror films and Jeffrey Salford's love of romantic comedies. Throughout the film, George remains unaware of Joe's killings, and he gradually falls more and more in love with him. George goes so far to defend Joe when his friends begin to suspect him, arguing,
"Well, he's not scary, he's gorgeous."
When his best friend Barnes points out Joe's more sinister traits following the disappearance of a friend. Additionally, while Joe acknowledges that George is his weakness and therefore a hindrance for his murderous ideations, he cannot kill him because of his love and newly discovered empathy for him. Gay love, as depicted in You're Killing Me, is healing and a positive thing in Joe's life. It is with love that the monster can gain empathy. Elliott Smith notes that queer audiences are drawn to the stories depicted in films like You're Killing Me because of a sympathetic identification with the killer's plight and a recognition of their similar status as potent threats to a vulnerable male power. This kind of characterization is especially appealing for queer audiences because of how it subverts the stereotypical association of slasher villains as non-emotive monsters and changes the victim-villain dynamic to a romance that goes against all of the odds, a romance that is queer in all respects. George's love for Joe is what humanizes him, and because we experience the narrative alongside George, we learn to care for Joe in the same way that he does. In the climax of the film, Joe asks George to run away with him to get a fresh start in a new state where he doesn't have to kill anybody because, plain and simply, he has fallen in love with him. The desire to move away from a home state, from heterosexist notions of family, and the rigid prescription of gender role expectations and parenting mandates is a particular desire with queer circles and are replicated through this narrative. And though George doesn't run away with Joe and in fact calls the police on him after sending him to the gas station with a hapless victim, he admits,
You wanna know what's crazy? Part of me wants to go meet him at that gas station.
Are you fucking kidding me?
and run away with him. In reference to the romantic relationship between Hannibal and Will Graham in NBC's Hannibal, whose own tragic story ends somewhat similarly to Joe and George's, Elliott writes that people often fall in love with monsters because they themselves long to be empathized with, and marginalized identities such as gay men and queer people so often receive little understanding from anyone besides the monsters that caught them. While the 2010s are a time where gay and queer voices are more vocal than ever, queer people and queer monsters as a result are still drawn to those who can offer unconditional empathy and understanding, no matter what they might be capable of.
And in the words of famous horror romance text, The Shape of Water,
when he looks at me, the way he looks at me, he does not know what I lack or how I am incomplete. He sees me for what I am, as I am.
You're Killing Me is a representation of the potential for queer horror in the late 2010s, in its undisputable dedication to depicting gay sensibility and camp culture through the use of comedy, romance, and horror. It additionally stands as a representative of the importance of digital media and queer artistry, and how the subversion of clash of slasher tropes can result in narratives that queer audiences' entire perceptions of what the horror genre can depict.
which brings me, faithful watchers, to our conclusion.
Horror, though particularly slasher horror, has been often written off as a genre without nuance or social commentary. Siskel and Ebert have called slasher films violent, extreme, grotesque, and nauseating, and dismissed the entire genre as misogynistic and a representative of conservative ideals. The term elevated horror has taken film criticism by storm, and as a means of distinguishing horror texts that are smart, art house, and classy from horror texts that are not. Such critics praise films like The Babadook and Get Out, while condemning films like Friday the 13th and Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the same breath. The horror genre has never been more celebrated, and yet it has also never been more disrespected. However, over the years, it has been continuously demonstrated that some of horror's main audiences include women and queer people, because of a sympathetic identification with its protagonists and the widespread focus of marginalized narratives that subvert the status quo and give voices to those so rarely heard. When queer people can read meaningful subtext into the relationships of men and monsters on screen, when women can recognize their own plights and struggles against male aggressors behind the final girls, this adds an undeniable nuance to those condemned texts and proves that they deserve a place in our cultural understanding of film studies. To dismiss them as low art and conservative is not only damaging to the horror genre, it is also demeaning to marginalized fans. Queer people have always had a long-standing connection with the horror genre, dating back to James Whale and the Universal Monsters in the 1930s, and queer horror fans and audiences continue to read Scream works in a way that uniquely ties each work to the contextual history of queer people at the time, demonstrating a historical importance to those texts. Additionally, the potential for successful franchise releases like like A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 and Scream, to be read as subtextually queer not only demonstrates the potential for explicitly queer stories to be successfully received, it also shows a connection with the queer politics of the time of each release and the metatextual quality and potential of horror and queer cinema. The desire for queer horror has never been more palpable. The horror streaming service Shudder recently disclosed that they would be funding a documentary about the importance of queer horror, and Scream Queen, My Nightmare on Elm Street, which details the retroactive relationship Mark Patton has with Nightmare 2, is currently filling cinemas across America.
As Nobel says, this year feels like the moment for queer horror, and indeed it feels like the monsters are finally coming out of the closet.
Hello Video Nasties, and thank you for watching my first series of essays. It's been an absolute joy to make these videos, and seeing so much positive feedback from them has been a dream come true. Fear not though, because this series is far from over. There are so many movies and shows I'd like to talk about the future, like The Lost Boys, Hannibal, the new Dracula series, and I'd also love to talk about lesbian horror and trans horror in a video soon. Ugh. So much queer horror, such little time. Please swing by my Twitter for some more hot takes on horror, and check out my brand new Patreon. It's pretty bare bones at the moment, but if you feel like tossing me a buck or two to show your support, it would mean the absolute world to me. There's going to be some perks coming soon, such as credits in my videos, and also the ability to vote on what I talk about in the future. So swing round, check it out. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this series and sticking with me for so long. Stay safe, and remember to always stay spooky.